Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. Please join me in welcoming our author Afshin Mulavi and Mina Al-Urabi, his moderator for tonight. And both of them will discuss the session From West to East, Shifting Sands. Over to you.
Thank you, Suha. So welcome to this session. Welcome to those of you here joining us. And of course, welcome to those of you who are tuning in online. My name is Mina Al-Urabi. I'm the editor-in-chief of The National here in Abu Dhabi. And today we're discussing how the world has changed. How the world has changed because of COVID-19. So I'm in a mask. Most of you are not with us in this room. And Afshin Mulavi, who would ordinarily be here with us, is going to join us through Zoom. So the world is changing, in part, of course, because of the pandemic and COVID-19, but in part also because we see an increasing move from west to east. Everything from the projects of the New Silk Road to the relationships that are being built with allies east of the UAE, but also the west remains relevant and important. Everything that we've witnessed in the past few months is accelerating some of these changes. And here to discuss this with me, although not in person, but very much in spirit, is Afshin Mulavi, who is an author, is editor and founder of Emerging World and the New Silk Road Monitor, and a former Reuters correspondent in Dubai, so knows the UAE well. Afshin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mina. It's really an honor to be with you.
Thank you for being here. So I guess as we talk about this shift from west to east, we also have to think about how the world has changed because of COVID-19, and not only because of the way we live our lives now, but also the politics and the socioeconomic consequences of what's happened. And how do you see the future for the region post those changes?
Thanks again, Mina, and thank you also to the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair for this invitation. And I truly wish I could have been with you. I'm a regular visitor to the United Arab Emirates and always find it to be one of the most interesting places really in the world to visit because it really does sit at the center of these east-west flows that you talked about and that we're going to be talking about today. But when we talk about COVID-19 and we talk about the world today, I often remember what Mike Tyson said, the great American boxer, Mike Tyson, who once famously said that everyone has a plan, that is until you get punched in the face. And this has been an enormous punch to the global economy, to societies, to our world. 3.5 million dead, more than 100 million jobs lost. Inequality rising, tensions boiling, healthcare systems, in many places on the brink of collapse. And so this has been an enormous punch. And when we all have kind of a world view that allows us to kind of analyze the world. And in my worldview, I've been really seeing this world shifting, as you noted. 85% of the world lives outside of the so-called Western world. 85% of the world lives in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. We've seen rapid urbanization all across this 85 world. We've seen unprecedented connectivity. The great story of the past quarter century has been the so-called rise of the rest. Frankly, we should call it the most rather than the West because we're talking about 85% of the world. But that's been the great story. So I guess we need to start this conversation by saying, okay, well, how have these trends held up to the COVID-19 punch? Now, in terms of demographics, the 85% is still going to be with us. I mean, we're still going to be living in a world where the West is a demographic minority by far. I mean, as tragic as the events of COVID-19 have been, and this has not been, the bubonic plague that, wiped out 1/3 of Europe, for example, in medieval era. So the demographic trends have been pretty stubborn and sticky. The urbanization trends have taken somewhat of a hit. We particularly in a place like India, where during lockdowns, we saw a lot of rural migrants to urban areas move back to rural areas. But as soon as, there's some level of normalcy and inshallah, knock on wood, India will emerge from, the tragedy that they're experiencing right now. But as soon as there is some level of normalcy, there will be a remigration to the urban areas across India. I guess the one that worries me, and also across the world, because there's a reason people are moving to urban environments, particularly in the developing world, it's because that's where the jobs are. And also, even if you are someone with a Zoomable job, the real dividing line today is those with Zoomable jobs and those without. That's also where the best bandwidth is. And then the last point is this, growing middle classes that we've seen, which has been one of the great hopeful signs across the emerging world, across Asia, across Africa. I worry, the World Bank notes that, we could see up to 150 million people fall back into poverty as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the great stories of the past 3 decades has been the decline in poverty rates. We've had 1 billion people lifted from poverty since the early 1990s. And I'm worried that this is, this punch is knocking people back into poverty. Certainly not, we're not back to where we were in 1990, but that has been a painful hit.
Absolutely right in terms of the impact on jobs, on urbanization and development in that 85% population of the world. But we've also seen certain countries, the UAE being ahead of them, certain countries dealing with the pandemic in a better way than some of the countries we would have expected to have dealt with it, primarily the United States, where you're based at the moment, and others at the beginning that seem to flounder with it. Why do you think that is, and how much do you think that's also changed how people look towards the East and look towards the West?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Amina, because in many ways we often talk about countries, in these terms like have and have-nots, and we think in terms of those that are haves are the ones who have money or resources. But in my view, the most important have to have, so to speak, is good governance, right? And when we've seen countries, COVID-19 has really exposed those countries that did not have resilient systems, that were not well prepared to handle a pandemic like this. And there have been some surprises, even some countries across Asia that you would have thought might have handled this better, didn't handle it as well. I think, you rightly point out that the UAE is one of those that is a have. And it's not a have because of its resources, it's a have because of, the good governance that it has displayed over the years, and almost that critical mass kind of came together to form this, very very well done response to this pandemic, and so you see it across the world. I think the United States early on in the pandemic did not respond well, but lately its vaccine rollout has been very strong, and we're inching back to normalcy in the United States. But what I worry about is this divide between the haves and the have-nots. Those who have good governance, those who have been able to handle this extraordinary pandemic, and those who have not, is creating even more inequality around the world. There was a UN official who described the COVID-19 as the inequality virus. And I think that's a good way to put it, because we're seeing the existing inequalities actually exacerbated, not only within countries, but also among countries as well. And that's really dangerous going forward.
So Afshin, I want to pick up on this inequality fears, but also how we emerge from the pandemic. But before I do, I want to remind everyone, I'm really keen to take your questions, be it here in the audience or online. So if you have questions, do send them through Zoom, because they're all going to come to me and I will be asking them. So please do join the conversation. But I wanted to ask you this point about the haves and have-nots and how we emerge. So looking ahead, looking forward, there are concerns about levels of poverty rising. There are also concerns about vaccine and how quickly certain countries will be able to catch up with the vaccine race. So then where does the role of major countries, be it the United States, be it China, be it others, come into play? And how is multilateralism faring, this, the UN, World Health Organization, in that emergence out of the pandemic?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question, because honestly, there is no more pressing or urgent issue that right now than economic recovery from this extraordinary COVID-19 punch that we have received. And while I understand that there's, we're having a conference on climate in November in Glasgow, Scotland, and those are very important issues. I can't think of a more important issue right now that we should be, focusing on every single day, every single moment on this in unequal recovery. You've seen the kind of some of the numbers where parts of sub-Saharan Africa may not be vaccinated enough to reach herd immunity until 2030. In parts of South Asia, we're still seeing something like that as well. Now, at the end of the day, there is enough money out there for us to get vaccines around the world. The IMF actually came up with a number that boggled my mind. They said with $50 billion, we can move pretty fast in vaccinating large swaths of the world. $50 billion is peanuts in a $20 trillion world economy, right? And so early on, there was some vaccine hoarding, and that's obviously, that needs to stop. The United States, you talked about major powers. The United States, if they're looking for a moment to lead, now is the moment. President Biden, when he came into office, he tweeted, "America is back." Well, if you really want to show that America is back, this is your moment. This crisis is America's moment to show America's back. Now, you have other countries as well that will need to play a role in this. The United Arab Emirates has been playing a prominent role in this, using both its trade infrastructure, its air infrastructure, its logistics infrastructure to get vaccines moving around the world. The United Arab Emirates, will play a role in this. The European Union has been relatively slow in their own vaccine rollout, but I think once we start getting to levels of herd immunity in the EU and in the United States, and we really need a concert of great powers to work on this issue, because I bring this up because over the past 30 years, this has been a great story. The rise of the rest, the rise of the emerging world, and we don't want to lose those decades of gains in something that is actually preventable. We can actually beat this pandemic.
Now, in the description of our session today, it very clearly asks, where does this leave the Middle East? So while we talk about these global trends and on a macro level, we also look at the Middle East. And I often, the National's tagline is the Middle East explained. And I often say the Middle East is so desperately different from one another. Each country is different. So it's sometimes hard to talk about the region. But if you were going to reflect about the region and where does this leave the region as a Middle East region, both the changes in politics and climate and of course COVID-19, where's your assessment? Where is the Middle East and how is it emerging from this?
And by the way, Mina, I'm not just saying this to you because I've known you for many years, but truly, you're doing an extraordinary job with the National. It's my daily read. And I'm someone who actually reads print newspapers. If I could find a way to get the print edition to my home, I would. But in terms of the Middle East and where the Middle East fits in many ways as part of these global trends. I mean, you do have haves and have-nots in terms of the governance, and some countries have done better than others in terms of the governance pre-pandemic and governance during the pandemic as well. But what worries me is that when I look back on December 17th, 2010, on the day that Mohammed Bouazizi faced off with the predatory police officer who told him he cannot provide for his mother and father and 4 brothers and sisters from his fruit and vegetable stall, and took away his license, and he ended up, as you all know the story by now, he ended up lighting himself on fire. And that act of self-immolation in many ways triggered the Tunisian uprising, which led to uprisings all across the region. When I look back at conditions around that time of 2010, and I look at conditions today, it's a worrying trend, because back then you had roughly 30% youth unemployment across the Middle East and North Africa region. Today you have roughly 30% youth unemployment across the Middle East and North Africa region. You don't have significant improvements in governance in many of the Arab uprising countries. You still have, over the past year and a half, just before the pandemic, we saw uprisings, protests across the region, from Iraq to Sudan to elsewhere, with many of the same themes of 2010, 2011. People And what, Mina, you know this so well, I mean, what people are asking for, they're not asking for anything outrageous. They're asking for, good governance, transparency, decent jobs, less corruption. I think the Arab Youth Survey that's done every year that shows young people ages between 18 to 24 and their viewpoints. I often point this out to policymakers in the United States that these demands are not outrageous. They're asking for a sense of normalcy and they're not getting it. So I do worry about several countries in the region with large youth populations that are increasingly urbanized, increasingly wired, increasingly connected, because I see some of the same trends we saw back in 2010, 11, today, only hyper accelerated because we're living in a world in which these things that are supercomputers, right? The smartphone has the same computing capacity, actually more computing capacity than NASA had to send a man to the moon, were not as prevalent as they are now back in 2010, 11. So I do have some worries about how the COVID-19 pandemic is going to accelerate some of these underlying trends that are a little bit worrying across the region today.
So if those are the worrying trends, what are the trends that make you optimistic about the region? Give us some good news, Afshin.
Absolutely, and there is a lot of good news, and particularly when I travel to the region and I speak with particularly the younger generation across the region, there is a sense, as I said, there is a desire for a normalcy. I mean, the desires of young people that I sense is the good news. When again I go to this Arab Youth Survey, when they ask them, do they support extremist groups? The answer is no. What do they want from their life? They want a good job. They want good educational opportunities. They want more women's rights, for example. When I've been traveling to the region for more than 25 years, a little bit more than 25 years. When I first landed in Saudi Arabia, working for an English language newspaper in Saudi Arabia, and the levels of economic development, the levels of women's access to education, women's access to senior positions has grown dramatically, and I think that's good news. The other piece of good news is you're seeing a lot better macroeconomic management across the region. I think there's some countries that are still leaving a lot of potential on the table. Egypt is leaving a lot of potential on the table. Iran is leaving a lot of potential on the table, but we're seeing better macroeconomic management across the region. But when you look into the eyes of a young Jordanian, a young Palestinian, a young Egyptian, young Emiratis and Saudis and Iranians, and you talk to them and you ask them about their hopes and their dreams. These are realistic hopes and dreams. These are hopes and dreams that young people have anywhere in the world. And I think that what's changed now than compared to maybe 40, 50 years ago is that they genuinely feel that these are fulfillable dreams. There is a meaningful aspiration. And when I see that, I feel very hopeful about the region.
That's great. Thank you. So I want to see if anybody has questions from the audience before I continue to ask mine. No? Okay, so my next question for you is about the new Silk Road. We heard a lot about this in the last 5 to 10 years, and the question is, has the new Silk Road lived up to its promise? What's your assessment of where it's going, and again, how it impacts the Middle East and North Africa region?
Absolutely. So, it's a really important question because probably the most significant geopolitical and geoeconomic story of the past quarter century has been the rise of China. The rise of China has redefined commercial geographies, economic geographies, and geopolitics around the world, frankly. And so when President Xi announced his vision for the Belt and Road in 2013, with 2 speeches, one in Indonesia and one in Kazakhstan, which he declared that he wants to see more Chinese investment in infrastructure projects across across broadly Eurasia, but also Africa. It was setting pretty ambitious goal. Now, have they reached the goals, those ambitious goals that they have set? Not entirely, but have there been a lot of bumps in the road? Have there been a lot of projects that didn't make a lot of economic sense that were funded? Yes, the answer is yes to that. But if someone who believes profoundly in the importance of infrastructure, I think that there's if you care about economic development, if you care about people, if you care about reducing poverty, then you need to care about infrastructure, because infrastructure is the road that takes you towards connectivity, that takes you towards economic growth, that takes you towards development. And so when I see large projects that China is funding or investing in around Africa, around Asia, for all of the problems that they may have, I see that road is helpful. That bridge, that port, not only Chinese companies are using that, but US multinationals are using that. European multinationals are using that as well. So when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa region, Chinese companies have targeted several projects across the region. It seems to me that there's 5 or 6 countries that have been the most significant targets of Chinese investment and construction projects, and they are the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, and Algeria. These are the ones when you actually look at the money, you follow the money. These are the places where China's poured a lot of its resources in. And then you have places like the United Arab Emirates, where China has become a real, in many ways, a strategic partner on economic and commercial projects. They're nowhere near a strategic partner when it comes to security or anything like that, but on economic and commercial projects. Whereas in a place like Egypt is becoming more and more reliant on China. The UAE is not about to fall into a China debt trap, for example, the way other countries may. And but I think writ large, China has become a defining player in the region in terms of investments, but a defining player in terms of its as an export destination. I did a study recently, and I'll just close with this. I did a study of just looking at China's economic footprint across the region, and I compared oil flows from the GCC states as well as Iran and Iraq to China versus oil flows to the United States. And it was, overwhelming. I mean, overwhelmingly, the oil is flowing east. 3 out of 4 barrels from the region head to Asia, and a lot of that heads to China. So in so many ways, the region's economic future is more and more tied to China's economic future. This does not mean it is entirely dependent on China's economic future, but it means that it is increasingly intertwined with China's economic future. And I think that in many ways, what is happening geopolitically is that countries are being asked to choose. And countries don't want to have to choose between China and the United States.
That's really interesting about having to choose between China and the United States, because in some ways, it's not the Chinese asking to make that choice. It's much more coming from the American side. And I wanted to ask you, of course, there's a new administration in Washington now. Biden administration has been very clear that it sees the challenges from China's rise. And so how much is that the pressure coming from the United States, on Europe also actually, not just the Middle East, about that, and how detrimental is that for the United States in the long term? Because the rise of China is inevitable. They can't stop it.
Absolutely. It has been striking to see the Biden administration's views towards China, because there was a view that China and this sort of very sort of hardline view towards China, that was a Trump administration view, and it wouldn't necessarily translate to the Biden administration. But the Biden administration has been equally as tough on China in terms of policy, if not in terms of rhetoric. And so this has clearly become issue number 1, 2, and 3 in U.S. foreign policy, is how to contain, how to manage a rising China. China. And as a result, U.S. allies, as you rightly pointed out, Mina, are being asked, at times to choose. And it is an uncomfortable position to be in, particularly if you are a country that generates a significant amount of your revenue from selling oil or gas to China. Now, by the way, when I did my study, I showed that the UAE is not one of the countries that is more reliant on China as, say, for example, Iraq is, or as Iran is, or and so it has a much more diversified trade portfolio. But when you derive a significant amount of your revenue from China, and you are being asked to choose, and who's asking you to choose? The country that is providing a great deal of security in your region, right? It has military bases across your region, has been the security underwriter for across the region. So it's a difficult place to be in. But I think the Biden administration is what we're witnessing right now is this slow decoupling of China and the United States. And I say slow. The reason I say slow is because this is not going to be an easy project by any stretch of the imagination. The United States and China are interlinked economically in ways that I think U.S. policymakers don't even understand. China is the United States' third largest trade partner. After all, there are 350,000 Chinese students studying in the United States, with all sorts of implications that has with in terms of the economic impact that they're making in the United States. U.S. companies, up until the pandemic, Starbucks was putting up a new coffee shop in China every 15 hours. McDonald's was putting up a new McDonald's restaurant in China every 2 days. The U.S. multinationals have been all over China over the past 2 decades. If you are, even if you work for the U.S. government, and you have a pension fund, chances are your pension fund is invested in China because your pension fund is invested in emerging markets, and China's accounts for about 40% of the MSCI Emerging Market Index. I bring all of this up to say that we are in new territory here, where the United States has declared a country a strategic adversary, right? And yet we are as economically intertwined with this strategic adversary as we've ever been. The United States was never this economically intertwined with the Soviet Union, but we're hearing similar Cold War style rhetoric out of Washington.
It's really interesting what you say about being intertwined, because one thing that often you hear people talking about is technology and AI. And some people say you might have, the decoupling between China and the US may include the internet and trying to pull the two apart. But then when you speak to people who work in technology, they'll say to you, you can't differentiate. You can't say this part of advancement is American and this part of advancement is Chinese or Eastern in any sense. It actually is growing together. So do you think sometimes there's a bit of an exaggeration? As you said, the decoupling is slow, but also there's an exaggeration about how much you can decouple the two.
You're absolutely right. I mean, because innovation is a iterative process, and the latest invention you build on the last and builds on the last and built on the last, and science and technologists are not going to be able to hide an innovation. Even if they choose to hide an innovation. And but having said that, in quantum computing, in AI, in 5G, we are seeing this kind of the great U.S.-China tech race, so to speak, and I think that clearly, when China decides to put its resources behind a particular technology, it has enormous, financial muscle to put behind it, but it also has enormous scientific and technological talent. And so there is I have no doubt that China is going to make extraordinary leaps in quantum computing, in AI, in 5G and next generation 6G technologies. But I also, having seen the enormous innovative capacity of the United States and Silicon Valley, I also have no doubt that the United States is not going to be left in the dust. There's a narrative that has emerged over the past few years that China is, here in the US, by the way, oh, China's eating our lunch, they're beating us, and they're, and when I see that, all I have to do is I look at, some of the big US multinational companies and how they got to where they are. These are not people that are wilting flowers, these are not the companies that will, go quietly. These are companies that have market capitalizations like Amazon. They have a market capitalization that is, almost roughly equivalent to, 15 countries across the Middle East and North Africa region's GDP combined, So market capitalizations that would make them G20 economies. So I think that the United States still has enormous technology firepower and innovative ability to go head to head with China in this. But just to bring it back to your point, when you talk to folks in Silicon Valley and you talk to people in startups in Shenzhen and Shanghai and other places, they don't necessarily see this as the U.S. versus China. They see this as my company versus your company. And that's healthy. That's healthy. Market competition.
So it's true, because so much of this is about economics and where the money is, and you, as you said, follow the money. But we're in a book fair, and culture is really important. So I wanted to ask you what role culture, popular culture, young people and pop culture, but also things, if we talk about money, like cinema openings now, for box office hits, you're looking towards China or you're looking east. So how much does culture play a role in this? In not only the competition between the United States and China, but also winning over the people of the world. How are they doing on that front?
I'm glad you brought that up, Mina, because one of the trends that I've been watching of great interest over the past decade and a half or so has been the rise of popular culture, popular entertainment from Turkey, from South Korea, from the Arab world, and how it is making its way into Western consciousness and into the Western world. So just to give you a few examples. Turkish soap operas. We all know about the story of Turkish soap operas. Turkish soap operas, in the late 2000s, they became all the rage across the Middle East and North Africa region, right? And that makes some sense. There's a certain cultural affinity. The shows were often about this tension between tradition and modernity that you would see in societies across the region. So that made sense. But then they began traveling further. And even today, Turkish soap operas are very popular across Latin America, and so here is a pop culture export which didn't come from Hollywood, that is making its way around the world. Korean pop is another example, K-pop. So Korean pop music, Korean culture has been traveling, all across Asia for quite some time. It has recently made its way to Europe and the United States, and as you've probably heard, the boy band BTS is probably the most popular boy band in the world right now. They filled before the pandemic. They filled a stadium in the United States that fills 100,000 people for one of their concerts, so the reason I bring this up is because it's not always, because it used to be always that Hollywood would produce things, and maybe sometimes in Europe, and the rest of the world would consume. And then in the rest of the world, there would be regional consumption of regional fare. But it's what we're seeing now is sometimes that regional, whether it's K-pop, whether it's these Turkish soap operas, are actually going global. Nigerian films, Nollywood. Bollywood is obviously the great example that's been around for a long time of a film industry that has gone regional and then global. But we're seeing this more and more, and I think that this is a very important development. And there's some extraordinary Arab and Iranian authors and artists that are making waves. Since this is a book fair, I recently read Jocha Al-Harthi's book, Celestial Bodies. I think it was in Arabic. Sayyidat
it was,
al-Qamar, I
yes.
think was the title. And it was just an extraordinary book, and it won the Man Booker International Prize, not the Man Booker Prize for translation of Arabic fiction. You know, it was the Man Booker actual international prize, and I think that was a really important moment. And I would love to see, you know, many more books like Jocha al-Harathi's book translated from the Arabic into English, because you know, when you read novels of the region, you get aspects of countries and societies that you're never ever going to get from policy books or newspapers.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you, when we talk about a shift, because our conversation has been dominated with China, United States, and we've talked about other countries and how they're impacted by this. But does that mean when we talk about the shift from west to east, we're actually talking about United States to China? Or as you're saying, we're talking about Turkish soap operas, and we're talking about Nollywood, and we're talking about technology transfer from different parts of the world. But is it predominantly driven by this G2 reality of US, China?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because it does take up a lot of the oxygen, this G2 question of US and China. But I certainly see it in a broader context. I mean, when I look at, again, going back to the so-called 85 world, the 85% of the world that lives in the non-West, when I go back to that and I see the urbanization and the connectivity and the growing middle classes, and I also see dynamic companies and dynamic firms. It's not just Korean and Turkish firms. It's also companies from the emerging world going global. I mean, you don't have to look far in the UAE. You just have to look at DP World's footprint around the world. You know, you just have to look at Emirates Airlines footprint around the world to see how you know, these kind of companies from the so-called, you know, East. I mean, I use terms like so-called because, you know, depending on where you are, you know, what is West, what is East, you know, and I like to refer to the Middle East as West Asia, because the Middle East was, of course, an invented term, invented by an American naval strategist writing in a British policy journal in 1902. And he declared this term the Middle East, if I may call it such, and it stuck. And frankly, it stuck, you know, in the Arab world as well. You know, we often, you know, refer to the term, the Middle East as الشرق الأوسط, right? So you've got this, but it's much broader than just China. If you look at some of the economic dynamism you're seeing in Southeast Asia today, even some of the extraordinary dynamism you're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa today, whether it's in mobile money, where you have some of the most dynamic mobile money companies are coming out of sub-Saharan Africa. M-Pesa in Kenya is just the most widely cited example. So I think it goes far beyond just China.
So you've seen me fiddling with my phone, in part because my phone needs me not to have my mask on, so it will let me open it so I can receive the questions from Zoom to ask you. So this is really, moderating in the era of COVID-19 is not easy. Okay, so we've got some questions. I could keep talking to you for hours, but I've got to start taking some of these questions.
Thank you.
So now that we've managed to open the phone while continuing to wear a mask, I've got the questions. Okay. So this is a really interesting question. One of our viewers asks, is Europe now inconsequential on the world stage? Does Europe matter?
That's a really good question, and I get the essence of the question, and I think that Europe still does matter. I mean, if you were to look at the European Union, and Europe matters partly because of the institutions that they have built. Right, so the European Union is still, you know, as a group, basically the largest economic zone in the world as a group of countries, and it still matters because of its economic heft. It matters because it plays a prominent role in the future of North Africa. You know, when you look at the commercial profile of North African countries, they are European. It plays a prominent role in the future of Africa itself, broader Africa as well. It plays a prominent role in diplomatic in multilateral institutions, but it's playing a very prominent role in one of the defining issues of our age right now, which is climate issues. The European Union has been leading on climate regulation issues. And what I often tell my students is that no matter what you think about climate change, I mean, it's here, but what's most important is not to debate climate change, it's to understand that climate policy is here to stay, and and the way it's moving, it's going to change the way we live and connect and produce and consume. And the European Union has been a leader in that regard. But certainly, to the questioner, it's an entirely relevant question, because we're not living in late 19th century anymore. We're not living in early 20th century anymore, when Europe mattered enormously. We're coming back to a world of the early 1800s, when China was the world's largest economy. We're headed back to China being the world's largest economy again. In the year 1880, the United States surpassed Great Britain to become the world's largest economies. And so we're heading back to a world where China is back. The U.S. maintains its pole position, and we're back to the G2. But I would contend that the European Union still matters.
Okay, that's good. I'm sure the Europeans listening will feel pleased.
Yeah.
But there's another question that says, does the U.S.-China rivalry, so this rivalry that we've been talking about, does that put Middle Eastern countries in greater danger from climate change that you spoke about, from disasters, and perhaps not just the Middle East? I mean, the world, does it become much more difficult for them to work together as we try to solve global problems, which both climate change and battling pandemics are?
That's a really smart question. I think that when you as I said earlier, that the issue of how to manage and contain a rising China has become issue number 1, 2, and 3 in U.S. foreign policy. I think issue, certainly in the top 3 issues across the region is how to manage the U.S.-China rivalry, right? If you are in Abu Dhabi, if you're in Riyadh, if you're in Cairo, if you're somewhere in the region, how do you manage the U.S.-China rivalry? Because there are times where you're going to be asked to choose. There are times where you're going to be asked not to do a particular project. There are times that you're going to be asked to pick a side. And I think to the broader point that the questioner is asking is, how could this, lead to any real problems and danger? Look, the nightmare scenario, of course, is a U.S.-China war, right? That's the nightmare scenario. And knock on wood, let's hope we don't get anywhere near that nightmare scenario. But if we do get to that nightmare scenario, then the questions are going to be a lot sharper about choosing sides. And I think those are going to be very uncomfortable answers if that time does come. It's not something I foresee anytime in the near future, but I think that absent an actual physical shooting war, I think that this is a manageable issue for Abu Dhabi, for Cairo, for Riyadh, for Baghdad, for other regional capitals.
I think it's also interesting to see, for example, in the UK, there was that big tussle over 5G. So you see that kind of choosing sides already, even before we get, and hopefully we'll never get to a nightmare scenario where it's an active war, but when there's an economic war, it can get very difficult. Another question, this is a great question. Will Arab culture flourish in this new world? Or will it just be increasingly influenced by other cultures and adopt these competing cultures? How do you see it from your perch in Washington?
Sure. As someone who has been traveling, to the Arab world for, as I said, almost 30 years now, from college onwards, I think that clearly, I'm biased in the sense that I've seen this vibrant culture, and I've seen this dynamism of these populations. I've read, many of the books, and I've seen films, and I think this culture should play a much more prominent role on the global stage. And so here's where it comes down to, places like the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair, and we simply need more translations of Arabic novels. The story of how Joka al-Harathi's novel was translated, there was a lot of serendipity involved in that. And I interviewed the translator of the novel, and it just happened to Joka al-Harathi, this Omani novelist who was living in Scotland at the time doing her PhD. She just happened to hand over this novel she was working on to a professor she knew, and that professor happened to say, "Oh, I'd like to translate it." But we need much more proactive work in that regard. And I think putting more Arab filmmakers forward and getting their work showcased more broadly. I think that once they connect to the grid, the global entertainment grid, we'll see many more people embracing Arab culture, and we're already seeing that via Netflix. Netflix has become a great platform for disseminating serials and films from around the world, and you can see some very good Arabic content, subtitled into English, on Netflix these days.
That's true, and also it's been fascinating to see how we have our own streaming services picking up in the region and distributing, content from around the world, but also distributing our own. So almost educating Arab audiences on Arab content. Sometimes the competition with these big production houses is very difficult. Okay, so Afshin, I want to change gear and ask you about an article you wrote recently, which was why travel matters. Because some people say, now that we can do this and talk from afar, and we have technology, and it's too difficult to travel, maybe we don't need to travel. Maybe we will close in on ourselves. But you wrote an argument talking about why travel still matters, and it's not only the beautiful hotels and so forth. So I want you to talk to us about that, why you think travel still matters, and what that future will look like in terms of travel and connecting in person.
Right. Thank you so much, Mina. It's an issue that's really close to my heart. First of all, I think that this kind of technology has been valuable, but it should not replace, actually going to places and seeing places and talking to people and getting to know people. I joke that in the article, I joked that when students at my university would come to my office and ask for some advice on a particular job, and I joked that I would just say, go. And what I meant by that is not leave my office. I meant go somewhere, go live somewhere in Latin America, go live somewhere in the Middle East, go spend 6 months, traveling across Asia. Because when you do, as Ibn Battuta, the great 14th century Moroccan traveler, said, travel, it leaves you speechless, and then it makes you into a storyteller. So I want them to go and be speechless for a little while and to listen and absorb and reflect and think. And then you come back and you really, you have gained knowledge, but you've gained a better understanding of the world, but you've also gained maybe a little bit more humility in your understanding of the world. And then, so that's kind of the broad canvas of it. But then when it's on a practical level, at the end of the day, when you attend a conference, for example, like this Abu Dhabi International Book Exhibition, you will attend many of the sessions, right? And you'll find them to be interesting, but it's the quiet conversations that you have off, in the corner of a session where you're having coffee with someone, you're getting to know someone, you're getting to know their family, you're getting to know their background. That connects you to that person, and then makes you invested in them and their future. and invested in them as a friend as well. And so I think that there's no replacing travel for the ability to understand places, the friendships that you form along the way, and then there's just an industry argument. 1 out of 10 jobs globally are connected to travel. A little more than 10% of global GDP is connected to travel. This is an industry that employs a lot of people. And when you think about it in those terms, you're actually contributing to jobs, you're contributing to economic development when you travel. But I can also, just to say, you and I have met on various occasions at various conferences. We've sat down together. We've had lunch with groups of friends, and we've gotten to know each other a bit, right? So we would not have been able to do that if it was only on Zoom. So I think that, I think that you cannot replace travel, and I'm looking forward to the day when we're all traveling again.
Inshallah, we look forward to welcoming you back in Abu Dhabi. Right, we're about to wrap up, so I have time for only one last question for you, and that is, we're at the book fair. So if you, first of all, I wanted to ask you, what's the best book you've read recently? And then I wanted to ask you, if you wanted us to read one book about this East to West transition, what would it be? So your 2 book recommendations before we wrap up.
Sure. I recently read The Dawn of Eurasia by Bruno Moisés. He's a Portuguese diplomat, and it was a really, I thought, a very valuable book about he traveled, basically the entire landmass of Eurasia, and it kind of ties into the question about Europe and does Europe matter, and he was showing how Europe's connectivity with Eurasia. I think Parag Khanna's work, a mutual friend of ours, The Future is Asian, is a very important work because he really does lay out the importance of the region of Asia to our collective future. It's not just the Asia's importance to the Asia's future, but the Asia's importance to our collective future. So I think that's a very good one to understand this shift east to west. And I think when it comes to reading, I love reading novels, and I'm rereading right now Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I'm going back to some of the classics, and the other one that I have been reading very closely is the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and partly because I think it's just beautiful poetry, the Edward Fitzgerald translation. But I'm also partly interested, and this also ties into one of the questions of how this poem by this medieval Persian era, astronomer, mathematician, poet, took the Western world by storm in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'm interested in that story as well. So the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, I recommend everyone go back to.
That's great. Thank you. What a great reading list. And it helps us travel while we are being grounded. We can travel that way, travel in time, and travel also to places. Afshin, thank you so much. It has been a delight having this conversation with you. I've really appreciated you making the time to speak to us, and we look forward to welcoming you back here. I also want to thank the Abu Dhabi Arab Language Center for organizing, of course, Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. I want to thank the translators, all the team that have put this together, the volunteers, our audience, and of course our audience online, but mostly thank you, Afshin, for making the time, and inshallah see you here another year.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Great to see you.